Hi, I'm Iain and welcome back to the Northland Workshop. I thought today we would do a video dedicated to choosing routers. Why? Because routers can be one of the most versatile tools in your workshop, but if you choose the wrong one, it's probably just going to sit in a corner collecting dust. So I dusted off my router collection and I thought we could go through them and take a look at a whole bunch of different models and see what are some of the good features, what are some of the bad features, so that way when it comes time to get your router, you have an idea of what you're looking for. And with most things, it's going to depend largely on what you plan to do with it. And as you see, some of these are better at certain things than others, and some of them I've set up for certain things versus other ones. Now, if you're like me and you like to kill time by looking at things on eBay, most of these routers you're going to see are not brand new. In fact, a lot of them are quite old, and there's a reason for that. There are some really good deals on used routers on eBay if you're willing to look for them. They don't pop up all the time, but all these used routers I was able to buy for less than $35 a piece. So you can get decent, well-made routers for a fraction of the cost if you're willing to put in a little bit of time and effort looking for them. But whether you're in the market for your very first router or you want to add a router to your workshop, I think what we're going to cover will help with all that. So first, let's take a look at my very first router. Here we have my Ryobi 1.5 horsepower router. And not only was this my first router, this was my first ever power tool. I got it as a present for my 11th birthday, and I have been destroying trees with power tools ever since. And this will always have a special place in the workshop because of that. Now this is a nice router and I like it, and I'm kind of sad that they don't make this one anymore, because if they did, I would recommend that if you're a hobbyist woodworker and you're just doing some projects on the weekends, this is a good router to have. And there's a couple things I like about it. One is it's got this great big spindle lock. What this does is when you set it over here to the lock position, it keeps the spindle from rotating. So that's the spindle. It's the part of the motor that actually spins, and as you can see, it's locked in place. That way I can come in here with the arbor wrench and loosen up the collet nut. The collet is the part that holds the router bit. Think of the collet as a drill chuck, except for routers. Drills have chucks, routers have collets. The collet is either built into the spindle itself, like this one is, it's all one piece, or you can have routers with removable collets. What you'll find is that on the lower priced routers, they're going to have the collet built into the spindle. That's not usually a problem, other than if the bit slips and spins and wears out this collet to the point where it can no longer grab the shank of the bit, your router is now toast. With the removable ones, all you have to do is replace the collet. The other thing you'll notice about this one is not only is it a machined collet into the shaft, it only takes 1/4 inch diameter bits. So that's going to limit how big a router bit you can use for this thing. One thing I like about this router is the fact that it has a trigger on one handle. That makes it really easy to start and stop the router without having to take your hand off one of the handles to find a switch on the motor. you're going to see a lot of these other ones, that's not the case. You have to remove one hand from the handle to turn it on and off, and that can be a little unnerving. The other thing that you might be able to see is that it has a lock for the triggers. So if you're doing long routing operations, or you mount this thing upside down in a router table, you can lock it on for long-term use. It has a big handle in the back for locking and unlocking the base, so that way it can be adjusted up and down with this ring. This ring takes a little getting used to. It's bulky and kind of hard to turn, but it always works, and it's very good at micro adjustments. Another thing that's nice about this router is the fact that it has this flat edge on the back of the base, so that way you can ride it up against a straight edge, and that just helps a little bit in case this base isn't fully centered. You know you're always going to have the same distance from here to the bit because you're always referencing off this flat face. Speaking of the base, this is where I start to get a little less positive about this thing. Whatever type of plastic this base is made out of, it's not very durable. It can get scratched up very easily and dinged really easily. Along with that, there is some sort of big adapter that's supposed to be able to go in here that lets you take guide bushings. And we'll talk about guide bushings in a minute. But when I got this router, they were phasing this one out, and I was never able to get the bushing adapter that goes in here. So I was never able to use guide bushings. Now there is a way around this, and that is with one of these universal guide bushing base plates. What I would do is I would take this base plate off and put this base plate on. And the nice thing is that it has umpteen million holes, so it's guaranteed that some of these holes are going to line up with the base plate. You might not be able to use all the mounting holes, but you'll be able to use enough of them to make this thing fit any router. There's a downside to it. In order to get these guide bushings, and there's a whole set of them that it comes with, in and out, you have to remove 3 screws and take this backing plate off. This backing plate goes into the router, so you have to remove this entire plate in order to change out the guide bushings. That's a major pain in the butt. I think I actually used this once before I gave up on it and got a different router that takes guide bushings. These are guide bushings. They are brass bushings that have different sized collars on them and threads on the back. You then use these threaded rings to lock these onto the base of a router. Now that router has to have a base designed to work with these collars unless you can get an adapter for your router. Let's move on to a fixed base router that I got specifically to use guide bushings on. If we look over here, you will see the primary router that I use with guide bushings. And this is a fixed base router, just like that Ryobi I showed you. What that means is there's no plunge mechanism. If you want to raise and lower the base or the bit, you have to manually unlock it and then change the height and lock the base back into its new height. It can't slide up and down on the fly. We'll get to the plunge routers in a minute and I'll show you how they do that. But this is another fixed base router. I recommend, if you're only going to have one router, to get a fixed base router, because it doesn't do everything a plunge router does, but I find they're a lot easier to control because they have a lower center of gravity. As you can see, the handles are right down low near the base of the thing. They're not up high, and the whole thing is a little bit shorter, so the center of gravity is down lower and it's less tippy. Now what you'll notice on this base is that it has this recess right in here, in this very small opening. That is for the guide bushings. And this is a Porter cable router with a Porter cable router plate. This is the standard plate they come with. These are Porter cable compatible guide bushings. They have kind of cornered the market on the style of guide bushings. So if you're going to get a router for guide bushings and you're not sure if it'll take guide bushings, I would recommend getting a Porter cable router, because then you can use any off-the-shelf guide bushings and they'll work with it, because again, that's just kind of the standard of these things. And because they're kind of the standard, you can get really cheap ones that fit it just fine. So to use a guide bushing, in this case I have a straight cutting router bit in this thing. As you can see, it's a 1/4 inch diameter shaft. This router, because it's a professional router, has the ability to replace the collets. So this has a 1/4 inch collet in it. It also has a 1/2 inch diameter collet. All I would do is unscrew the 1/4 inch one and screw the 1/2 inch one in if I want to use 1/2 inch diameter bits. You can get almost any bit you want in a 1/4 inch bit, so if that's all you have for a router, that's perfectly fine. However, there are larger router bits that only come with a 1/2 inch diameter shaft, and in that case you're going to want a router that can handle a 1/2 inch diameter shaft. So, got a 1/4 inch shaft bit in it. It's a 3/8 straight cutting bit, and say I want to use it with a template for some template routing for whatever reason. Well, let's say this is the size bushing I want. That slides down into that recess and pushes down just below flush. Now what I do is I hold it in place and I turn it over, and I can thread the locking ring on. Now I could do this without taking the whole motor off, but it would be a little hard for the camera to see at that point. So all I do, snug it down. You want to snug it down really well and check it after the first couple minutes of routing to make sure it hasn't loosened up. The brass ones are pretty good about not loosening up. The steel ones that look silver, sometimes they can loosen up a little bit. But either way, want to check it. And now that I have it on, I can go ahead and put the base back on. Now this base adjusts the bit height up and down by rotating the entire base. There's a downside to that. The downside to that is that because the base rotates and the handles are attached to the base, the toggle switch on this thing, that's the on-off switch, is constantly changing position. So it's always kind of having to fumble around to try and figure out where that switch is. That's a little disconcerting. The other thing is that because the switch is way up there, I have to take one hand off the tool in order to turn it on and turn it off. So again, that's just something that's less than ideal with this thing. Now you see this ring. This ring is a little bit different than the Ryobi ring. The Ryobi ring, you turn the whole ring to raise it up and down. This isn't like that. There's a spiral groove cut in the base, so when you rotate the motor housing, it goes up and down. So what is this ring for? Well, if you look really, really closely at this motor, you're going to see a score mark right there. And if we look on the other side of it, there's another score mark right there. Well, what you would do is you would set the bit height to 0, so I would lower it down until it's just flush with this collar, or just flush with the base if I wasn't using the collar. And I would then rotate this ring that has all these marks on it in fractions of an inch to 0. So let me find the 0 here. right there. So I've now zeroed it out with the score mark on the motor and the 0 right there. So say I wanted to raise it 1/8 of an inch. I would loosen up the handle and I would turn it to the 1/8 inch mark. And as you can see, this thing is marked in 64ths of an inch, so you can really dial it in. If I wanted to raise it up 1/4 inch, I could turn it to the 1/4 inch mark, 3/8, 1/2 inch, and so on. If I want to lower it, I would simply turn it to one of the marks on the other side of 0. And so that's how that ring works. It's just an indicator ring. It's not an adjustment ring. You just zero it out and then turn the cursor on the motor to the setting that you want. So that's the router that I tend to use for guide bushing work. The nice thing about these old Porter cable routers is that production shops use them all the time, and so they are everywhere for a very low price used. Next, we have just a router base in a router table plate. And if you take a look, this is just a commercial router table plate. You can get them through any kind of woodworking supply catalog. It has little leveling feet in the corner, so that way you can mount it flush to the table. And it has a series of rings. So as you use bigger and bigger bits, you remove more and more rings. But then as you use smaller bits, you start putting the rings in, so that way you don't have a big gaping hole in the way. You'll notice that I have a router base in the plate. That is so I can just take the motor out of this router and put it right in here, and it's hanging upside down in my router table. And I've done that for a long time. Again, the nice thing is, because this model is so popular, you can buy these old bases dirt cheap and have a dedicated base for your router table. However, there's a downside to that setup. For one thing, if you have your router set up to do one thing, you got to take it all apart, take the motor out, you got to get under the router table and put the motor in. That's a bit of work. So the other issue is you have to adjust it by reaching under the table, loosening the clamp, and then raising it up and down. Because of that, I went looking for a different router that is going to replace this base in the router table. This is my future router table router, and I chose this one for the router table for a couple reasons. For one thing, this is a 2 1/4 horsepower router, so the horsepower is a little bit bigger than the 1 1/4 horsepower Porter cable we were just looking at, so it can run bigger bits. And because I'm not a production shop, this thing could even handle doing the big raised panel bits as long as I take multiple passes and I don't push it too hard. So that's one nice thing. To do the bigger bits, you need to have variable speed on it. You can get a little add-on box that is essentially just a light dimmer that you plug your fixed speed router in, and you can vary the speed that way, but it really doesn't work that well. The reason for that is as you start using the router for something and you put it under more and more of a load, it's going to try and slow down. Well, the little add-on box doesn't have any smarts to it, so it's going to turn your router into a gutless wonder. With a true variable speed router, where the knob is actually built into it, it actually has feedback in the motor that monitors the RPM, and as you start loading down the motor, it starts bumping up the power to it in order to try and keep it at whatever speed you set it at. Think of it as cruise control. Some of them, the cruise control works a little better than others, but they're all better than the little add-on box that you just plug in and turn the knob. So I want variable speed. Another reason I decided to get this router for the router table is the way it adjusts the height, which is a little bit different than the router we just looked at. You no longer have to turn this base to move it up and down. Now we have this thing. The way this one works, there's this cam lock, so no more turning the key to loosen it or tighten it. And we have this micro adjustment knob that we can turn to raise it up and lower it down. Now if you're doing bulk adjustments, you're going to be here all day turning that little knob. So it's got this little lever on it that when you pull in on it, it disengages the threads on this rack right here, and it lets you slide it in up and down. For coarse adjustment, it re-engages the threaded part and you can do your fine adjustments with that. Well, that's all fine and good, but I really want to be able to adjust it from above the router table. Now you can spend a couple $100s on a router lift, and if you're a production shop, a router lift is a great thing to have. However, for the hobbyist, they're not real practical. This one and a lot of other ones on the market today do something that gives you pretty much the same features as a lift, but it's built into the router. And what this has are these two holes right here. And if you take a look, there's two hex-shaped shafts right here. Well, when you mount this router base in the router table plate, you have to drill 2 extra holes for those holes. And that is for this hand knob right here that has a hex-shaped shaft at the bottom. The way this works is you first stick it in this hole, you turn it, and that unlocks the clamp. Then you can use the micro adjust thing from above the table, because it's like this the whole time, and you can go ahead and adjust the height of the router bit just like that. Not quite a router lift, but it is very, very close, and a lot less money than a dedicated router lift. And again, a lot of fixed base routers nowadays have that sort of above the table depth adjustment. So if you're looking for a fixed base router that's a newer one, I highly recommend you get one that has the built-in above the table height adjustment. Everything comes at a cost, and that old Porter cable router that I showed you that I use for the guide bushings is great, but that opening on the base is very, very small. So it limits you to how big a diameter bit you can actually use in the thing, and even some of the smaller round over bits just don't fit through that opening. So I have this even older router, back when it was Rockwell, from the 60s, and if you look, other than the finish is a little bit older, the only real difference is I have this clear sub base on it. And this clear sub base has this great big opening. And if you look real closely at this base, you'll see these two holes right here. Well, remember how I pointed out those holes for above table adjustment on the newer Porter cable router? Yup, this is the base that came with that router. I took it off there because it's not going to need it on the router table, and I put it on this one because of the big opening. And again, just like before, you can get 1/2-inch diameter collets, 1/4-inch diameter collets for this thing. And the nice thing is, big opening for round over bits. This one has a metal indicator ring, but other than that, it's the same thing. You got the markings on it and the little score marks on the motor itself, so you can adjust it up and down like before. One thing you'll notice is these handles are kind of egg-shaped. That's fine, but I want to show you one of the drawbacks to any of these type of fixed-based routers. Let's just, for argument's sake, say I was going to round over the edge of my workbench here. So what I would do, I would loosen up the clamp and I would turn the motor to wherever I want the round over to be. And now I have an issue. The issue is I have less than half of the router base on the workpiece because the router bit is right in the middle. I've got the ball bearing. I can never center it directly over the workpiece. It's always going to be hanging off. So what that causes me to do is put pressure down on the handle on the inboard side because otherwise this thing wants to rock. And if I let it rock while I'm using it, it's going to ruin that edge. So what I find myself doing is pushing down on this thing way harder than I have to because I really don't want it to rock like that. Because of that, I found another router that I really like for doing edge treatments. And this is a style of router that I think you're really going to like if you want to do a lot of roundovers and stuff like that. So let's see what that router is. And here is my favorite router and also my oldest router. This one, another Rockwell from either the late 50s or early 60s. And this one is a D-handle router. And you can see why it's called a D-handle router. The handle is in the shape of a D, kind of like a circular saw handle. Well, the nice thing about this is it gives me lots of control over this thing. I can get it way out there and still be able to keep it from tipping with one hand. So this is the thing I like to use the most for rounding over edges, chamfering, stuff like that. You'll notice that I have outfitted it with a clear base plate with a great big hole because again, I don't use this thing for guide bushing work, I use it for edge treatments. And this chamfer bit is one of the bits that would never fit through a standard Porter cable base. As you can see, if I loosen up this clamp, I have to unplug the motor because the motor rotates. I can turn it to whatever depth I want, lock it in place, then go ahead, plug this little cord back into the D handle. Don't look too closely at the cord, it'll scare you. And as you can see, I can very easily chamfer that edge without any fear of it tipping this way. One thing to be aware of, if you get this model router, and this is the motor's model number is 103077, and it's a model 150M type 3. One thing to watch out for with these is, for whatever reason, the little plastic cap that goes on the top of this motor, they all seem to meet an untimely demise, and I've never found one that actually has the cap intact on it. What that means is that the commutator on the motor is fully exposed, and if this thing was on and I stuck my finger in here, I would get zapped and it would chew up my finger because it spins. The moral of the story is don't stick your finger in moving motor parts and you'll be just fine. But it's just one thing to be aware of. Other thing to be aware of, this collet is different than the later version of the Rockwell Porter cable collet. This is a 1/4 inch collet only. It won't do 1/2 inch, so just be aware of that if you're in the market for this model router. Other than that, it is a great router. I really like it. It's my favorite one. So there's one last fixed base router I want to bring to your attention, and it's hiding behind this dovetail jig. And there's a reason for that. It's the one that I use only for dovetailing, and that is this. This is a little 7/8 horsepower Rockwell router that somebody painted blue at some point, so I call it R2D2 because it kind of looks like him. And the nice thing about this is it's much smaller and lighter than the standard size Rockwell router. This is 1¼ horsepower, this is 7/8. 7/8 horsepower is plenty for running a dovetail bit. The other nice thing is, because this thing's dedicated for the dovetail jig, I can leave the bushing in place, I can leave the dovetail bit in place, and I leave the height set. So as long as I always have a 3/4 inch thick drawer front and 1/2 inch thick drawer sides, I never have to adjust the height of this bit, which is really nice because it takes a while to get that height fine-tuned. And with this thing being a little bit lighter, lower center of gravity, it makes it a lot easier to run around on this jig. So this is the one I use for dovetailing. However, there are some things that fixed base routers aren't the best at. One of those things is plunging. Well, thankfully they make plunge routers. So let's take a look at two plunge routers. This is a dedicated plunge router. This is my 2 horsepower Ryobi plunge router. They still make this one. It is now limesicle green, but they still make this one. This one was made in the USA. The new one, not made in the USA. Actually, both Ryobi routers I have were made in the USA because they used to make quite a bit over here. Now they don't. Anyways, I also have this Porter cable plunge router and this fixed base. This was a set, and this set came with one motor, a plunge base, and a fixed base. And you see that all the time, and they do a marvelous job marketing these things as basically you get 2 routers for the price of 1.5 routers. I'm here to tell you, no you don't. Because it is a royal pain to change it from the fixed base over to the plunge base, that pretty soon you decide one of the bases is just never going to be used again and it's going to live in one. Because again, it's a pain in the butt to change bases. Now some of them are probably better than others. This one's horrible at changing back and forth. So here it is in the plunge base. It's been in the plunge base for years and it's probably never going to leave. So for all intents and purposes, it's a plunge router. And of course this thing is just a plunge router. So let's take a look at this plunge router first. I'm going to move this guide for a second. We will get back to that in just a minute. So with a plunge router, it has springs in it that let it plunge up and down, hence the whole plunge router thing. One nice thing about plunge routers is that the motor never changes in relation to the handles. So with this one, I have the on-off switch right here, and it's always right there. No matter what height this thing's at, I always have the on-off switch right next to my thumb. So that's really nice. I can hang on to the handle at all times. The downside to a plunge router is that they have a very high center of gravity, which makes them kind of tippy. And the other thing is they're a bit more complex. You have linear slides with metal rods that it has to slide up and down on. They have to be accurate so it doesn't sit there and rock back and forth as it goes up and down. That all adds to the cost. A plunge router for a given horsepower will always be more expensive than a fixed base router just because there's more to it. You have a depth rod right here with this little sight line that you can move up and down and some form of adjustable stop at the end. The way this works is you would zero it out by touching the top of the workpiece with the bit, and then you would come along after you lock it in that height, loosen up the depth rod, butt it up against the little turret, and set that to 0. Now if I wanted to plunge, say, 1/4 of an inch more, I would move the rod up to where it says 1/4 inch, and now with the router on and the bit spinning, I can go ahead and plunge it the rest of the way down, and I know I've plunged it in 1/4 of an inch. So that's very nice. They all have some form of depth stop and turret system at the bottom. The reason for the turret system, in this case this has big steps, whereas this one has many little steps that it adjusts to as you turn it, is so that way if you're making a mortise or something that is a very deep cut, you can't make it all in one pass, you can plunge down, route out a little bit more, plunge down again, route out a little bit more, and each time you turn the turret one more click to gradually lower you down to your final depth. All plunge routers have some form of turret, little indicator stop. It's just a matter of which side it's on and whether the little indicator is a red line on a piece of plastic or a metal pointer. Just varies by manufacturer. This one, again, is variable speed. So it has letters on it, and you have to look in the manual to figure out what RPM goes with what letter. Not a big deal, and it's a nice feature to have. If you're going to have a router that's 2 horsepower or over, I highly recommend you have variable speed so that way you can use bigger router bits. Now for the downside of this plunge router. That is the base. Again, this is the weak link with these Ryobi routers that I have, is always the base. This takes the same bushing attachment that the other one does, even though this was brand new production when I bought it. It's still not available, so no guide bushings for it. Boo, failure. Now this thing is a little bit different. It has a 1/4 inch bushing that goes in its 1/2 inch diameter collet. So the collet itself is set up for a 1/2 inch diameter bit, and then to use a 1/4 inch diameter bit, you simply put the 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch bushing in it. Now, one thing that's nice about this thing, it has a removable collet. So if this gets damaged, you can replace it and not have to replace the entire router. So that's nice. You'll notice this little pin right here, that is the spindle lock for this thing. The Porter cables, other than the real new one right here, all the other ones do not have a spindle lock. You have to use 2 wrenches for it. I actually prefer the 2 wrenches versus 1 wrench and a spindle lock because it's a lot easier to hang on to 2 wrenches than to have this thing try and twist all around. But that's just personal preference. Some people really like the spindle lock, and so it's nice to know this one has one. Now, one thing to take a look at is the fact that you have this little locking lever right here. The way this thing works, if I lock it, I can't push it up and down. If I unlock it, I can push it up and down. Little plastic lever, metal screw. The metal screw just works like a set screw on the guide post. Could it eventually mess up the guide post as you clamp it? Maybe, but I've had this thing for years and it works perfectly fine. So when it's in the upright position, it's unclamped, it moves up and down. When you lock it, it's clamped. One thing to notice, all these routers except the first Ryobi I showed you have brush caps for the carbon brushes that give power to the motor accessible from the outside. That's really nice because sooner or later you're going to have to replace those brushes, and it's nice to be able to replace them without disassembling the entire thing. It always gives me a feeling of confidence when I see brush caps that are accessible from the outside of the tool, because it tells me that they plan on the thing being around long enough to have to replace the brushes. So that is the Ryobi plunge router. One thing, if you're doing a whole bunch of dados or anything referencing off the edge of the workpiece that doesn't have a pilot bearing like the roundover chamfer bit had on it, you can get one of these guide fences. This is the Ryobi guide fence. It's just metal fence with a cutout for the bit to go and metal rods. And on this plunge router, you will see these two holes and these wing nuts. Now the fixed base Ryobi router also has same guide holes and wing nuts, so you can use it on it too. However, I tend to use it on this. And the way it works is it simply slides in, and you can adjust the distance between the bit and the fence to whatever it needs to be, and then lock it down into place. This can be a little bit time consuming trying to get that dialed in just right, and it involves a lot of tapping it back and forth. So for the Porter cable ones, there's a better way. And that is this edge guide. Now this edge guide is a micro adjust edge guide. It's got very short pins, so it's not made to slide back and forth on the pins. It's made to simply attach to the router base with the pins. And then you have these two locking nuts right here. You loosen it up and you can do your course adjustment in and out. Then you lock this far moving piece into place, and if you use this brass knob, you now have a micro adjustment to move the fence in and out to get it dialed in right where you want, and then you finally lock that in place. That goes in two holes on the back of the Porter cable router. It just has screws that attach instead of the wing nuts. That's okay. It works perfectly fine. And it gives you the straight edge for it. And all the other Rockwell Porter cable bases all take the Porter cable edge guide. They also make a standard edge guide that is just like the Porter cable one with rods. But if you're going to get it, I recommend you get the micro adjustable one, because it is kind of handy and it makes setup much faster than the other style. Now there's a couple differences about this plunge router versus the Ryobi. In this case, the switch is on the other side. Again, this motor doesn't spin in this base, so the switch always stays in the same relationship to the handle. So that's kind of nice. This one, the plunge handle is over here, and it's spring-loaded. It springs back into the locked position, so I can't push it up and down, and so I manually have to pull it to unlock it and slide it up and down, and then when I get it where I want, let go, and it stays right there. you might have heard that rattly sound on it. What that is there's a little plastic bushing that just kind of rubs on these threads. The Ryobi one has the threads as well. I just didn't show them. What this is a depth stop. So before you had your plunge depth stop, that was the rod on the front. This has a set of knurled wheels that you can set to adjust how far up it goes. So this rod was to set the plunge depth. The other one is to set the retracting depth. The nice thing about this is you can use this as a micro adjuster. If you plunge it a little bit, turn it ever so slightly, lock it back together, back it up to it, you can adjust the height. Very, very fine adjustment with that. Some people use plunge routers in router tables and all they do is use that adjustment for it. That's kind of time consuming, but you can do it. But for plunge routing operations, these are the two routers I use. If I need variable speed for big bits plunge routing, I reach for Old Reliable here. If I need, you guessed it, guide bushings, I use this plunge router right here. So I hope talking about the features of some of these routers and the reason I like features or dislike features help you when it's time to buy your router or add a router to your router collection. As you can see, one router isn't perfect for every situation. Every router is better at some things than others, and it just depends on what you're going to use it for. Now, are you going to necessarily go out and acquire an entire collection? Well, maybe you like collecting routers. If you don't like collecting routers, you don't have to. What I would recommend is asking yourself, what is it that you're going to use the router for the most, and then choose the router that does that the best, because it'll do all the other jobs somehow. That's the nice thing about the versatility of the router. It just might require a different sub base, a little bit of setup, a little bit of adjustment, but it can do it. So as long as you know what you're going to use it for the most, you can make an informed decision about which one to buy. Now, maybe you don't know what you're going to use it for the most, in which case I would go with whichever router you want, because more than likely, sooner or later, you're going to end up with at least two routers. And whichever one you start out with will help you figure out what your next one will be. So again, I'm Iain Porlupi for the Northland Workshop. Thanks for stopping by and talking about routers.